The worn wood-paneled walls of courtroom 4B hummed with an anxious, uneasy silence. The stale air was heavy, thick with the scent of old paper, cheap cologne, and quiet indignation. The kind of air that made your skin crawl if you lingered long enough. On this unremarkable Wednesday afternoon in downtown Atlanta, a small group of people had gathered for what was supposed to be a routine session of petty crime hearings. Shoplifting, minor traffic violations, trespassing. The city's overlooked and ignored shuffled through the doors one by one. At the front, presiding over the chamber like a minor deity in black robes, was Judge Alton Whitaker. The man was an institution. Decades on the bench, a well-oiled gavel, and a reputation whispered about in back hallways and barbershops alike. A cruel smirk seemed permanently etched on his weathered face, one eye always squinting in suspicion, the other gleaming with a mixture of boredom and disdain. He'd made a habit out of belittling defendants who didn't fit his narrow image of respectability. And today he found his next target. Docket number 4297, Malik Carter, the bailiff called, his voice monotone, carrying no sympathy. A murmur passed through the sparse gallery as a young black teenager stood. He looked no older than 17, wiry frame, brown skin gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, dressed in worn jeans and a faded Atlanta Braves hoodie. His eyes, dark, sharp, and unreadable, met the judge's gaze without flinching. Whitaker leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk creeping across his face. He tapped the gavel lightly against the desk as if playing with his food before devouring it. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he drawled, his voice thick with condescension. "Another fine example of today's youth. What's the charge, bailiff?" The bailiff cleared his throat. "Trespassing, Your Honor. Accused of entering private property, Dalton and Sons Auto, and after hours." "Trespassing," Whitaker repeated mockingly. "Imagine that. A bright future in crime ahead, no doubt. I suppose you were just out for a stroll, or maybe casing the place for your next job." A few chuckles rippled from one side of the gallery, mostly from the usual cluster of courthouse clerks and petty officers, people who'd long learned it was safer to laugh along. But in the back row, an older black man sat perfectly still, impeccably dressed in a gray tailored suit, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, hands resting on a leather-bound portfolio. He watched the scene with steady, unblinking eyes. When the judge made his remark, a faint, knowing smile curled at the corners of his lips. Malik didn't speak at first. He let the silence stretch, let the tension mount, let Judge Whitaker bask in the sound of his own contempt. Then, with a calmness that was almost unsettling for a supposed delinquent, Malik raised his hand slightly. "Permission to speak, Your Honor." The words were crisp, deliberate. No slang, no hesitation. Not the tone of a scared teenager facing the wrath of authority. Whitaker arched an eyebrow, bemused. "You can try, boy, but I don't see what you could possibly say to help yourself." Malik took a single step forward, the chain on his ankle clinking softly against the floor. And though he was no more than 5'9" in that moment, he seemed to fill the room. "I have something to say that might change the nature of these proceedings, Your Honor." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps curiosity, crossed the judge's face. He gestured dismissively. "Fine. Entertain us." The courtroom waited, some expecting a stammered plea for leniency, others a futile protest of innocence. No one, not even the amused court stenographer tapping away, could have predicted what would come next. Malik Carter, the boy accused of trespassing, the boy who should have been shaking in his sneakers, lifted his chin and began to speak, not like a scared defendant, but like a scholar dissecting a case study. "If it please the court, I was present at Dalton and Sons Auto on the evening in question, as part of an authorized investigation. I possess documented evidence that will not only exonerate me, but implicate a member of this court's staff in acts of misconduct directly related to this very courtroom." A sudden hush fell. Even the ceiling fan seemed to pause. Judge Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "What kind of game are you playing, boy? but Malik only smiled faintly. If this story of injustice and transformation moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that turn pain into power. At the very back of courtroom 4B, the older man in the tailored gray suit leaned forward, resting his elbows casually on the polished oak railing. His eyes didn't leave Malik for a second. The gallery might have been murmuring. The stenographer's fingers might have hovered uncertainly above her keys, but the man's gaze was steady, alert, the look of someone who already knew how the story ended and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. His name was Ezra Langston. In the legal world, Langston's name was something of a whispered legend, especially in civil rights circles. A federal investigator with a reputation for dismantling corruption in small-town courtrooms, he'd walked through more shadows than most men lived to see. And yet here he sat, expression unreadable but for the faint knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as the teenage boy outmaneuvered the arrogance in the room with surgical precision. Judge Whitaker, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere, sneered, "Son, this is a petty trespassing case, not a stage for your bedtime stories. Whatever evidence you claim to have won't buy you 5 minutes of my time." The courtroom chuckled again, a little thinner this time, as if even the sycophants sensed a tremor beneath their feet. Malik remained utterly still, the only movement a slow raising of one brow. "Respectfully, Your Honor, perhaps you should review Section 312.9 of the State Judicial Conduct Code, subparagraph B. It stipulates that any evidence pertaining to the misconduct of court personnel or officers of the court, if presented under oath, must be entered into the record immediately." There it was, the first visible crack in Whitaker's facade. A brief narrowing of the eyes, a twitch of his fingers against the gavel handle. Not because Malik's words carried the weight of law, though they did, but because no kid in a tattered hoodie was supposed to know a clause buried in the conduct code. "Is that so?" the judge said, his voice low, tight. "I can quote it verbatim, if necessary," Malik offered, his tone that same infuriating calm. From the gallery, Ezra's smile deepened, his fingers tapping once against his leather portfolio. "Well then," Whitaker snapped, clinging to what was left of his authority. "Let's hear this evidence." Malik turned his head slightly, looking toward the bailiff. "Officer Dawes, if you would kindly retrieve the envelope labeled Exhibit A from the inside pocket of my jacket, currently held at the defendant's check-in desk." There was a beat of frozen hesitation. The bailiff, a grizzled white man who'd been in this courtroom longer than most of the furniture, glanced toward Whitaker for guidance. The judge, teeth grinding audibly, gave a stiff nod. Dawes left and returned moments later with a manila envelope. He handed it to the judge with an almost reluctant flick of his wrist. Whitaker yanked it open, pulling out a sheaf of neatly printed papers, a flash drive clipped to the corner. His eyes darted across the top page, and in an instant the blood drained from his face. The room sensed it before anyone spoke. Ezra Langston straightened, no longer leaning but sitting upright, arms crossed as if settling in to watch an empire crumble. Whitaker fumbled through the next few pages. Photographs, copies of text messages, recorded statements, all neatly indexed and dated. And at the center of it, evidence of Judge Whitaker's complicity in case-fixing, suppressing evidence, and improperly sentencing young black defendants at the behest of favored prosecutors and police officers. He looked up, and for the first time in his career, the arrogance was gone. Where did you get this?" Malik didn't answer right away. He let the weight of the question hang in the room, let Whitaker's breath grow shallow and the sycophant's faces pale. Then he smiled, just slightly. "I don't think I'll spoil the surprise just yet, Your Honor." The older man in the gray suit let out a low chuckle, the sound rich and heavy with satisfaction. This courtroom, so long ruled by fear and unchecked power, had no idea it was already standing on a fault line. And Malik Carter was the one holding the match. The tension in the room thickened, like a coiled wire about to snap. Malik Carter stood in the center of it all, cool as rain, a calm ripple in a storm of unraveling authority. He didn't fidget, didn't stammer. His eyes stayed locked on Judge Whitaker's face, watching the dawning terror creep up behind the old man's sneer like a storm tide swallowing a sandcastle. "You seem nervous, Your Honor," Malik observed, his voice smooth, his diction precise, a voice that didn't belong to a boy accused of trespassing, a voice that belonged behind a lectern in a law school classroom or standing before a jury. Whitaker tried to recover, waving the papers like they were meaningless. This is nonsense," he barked. "Fabricated, circumstantial. You think you can bring this kind of garbage into my court and—" "Your court?" Malik cut in, sharp as a scalpel. "Correction, sir. This is the people's court. And while it might have felt like yours for the last few decades, that reign of unchecked bias and petty tyranny ends today." A collective gasp rose from the spectators. No one spoke to Judge Whitaker like that. Not prosecutors, not defense attorneys, not even other judges in private chambers. But here was this kid, or so they thought, dismantling him with the casual ease of a man unscrewing a faulty light bulb. Ezra Langston, still seated in the gallery, chuckled again, this time loud enough for the judge to hear. His arms crossed, his eyes gleaming, as though he were witnessing a masterpiece in its final strokes. "Bailiff," Malik continued without missing a beat. "As per procedural code, I formally request that these documents be entered into the record under a motion for immediate judicial review. Furthermore, I request protective custody for myself and my legal team." "Legal team?" Whitaker spat. A quiet stir came from the courtroom doors. Two figures appeared, both dressed in immaculate dark suits. One was a black woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard clutched tight against her chest. The other, a tall Latino man carrying a worn leather briefcase. Both moved toward the defendant's table with practiced confidence. Ezra Langston rose now, moving down the aisle as the courtroom's collective heartbeats skipped. His voice boomed as he approached. "Allow me to clarify, Your Honor," Ezra said, removing a gold badge from his inside pocket and holding it high. "Ezra Langston, lead investigator, Federal Civil Rights Division. These two are Assistant U.S. Attorneys Martinez and Fields. And this," he gestured toward Malik with a reverence usually reserved for judges and generals, "is Attorney Elijah Carter, credentialed with the Georgia State Bar at the age of 21, graduate of Harvard Law, and special counsel to the Justice Department." The entire room seemed to shrink, the air sucked from the walls. Elijah Carter, offered a small, amused bow. "Surprise." Whitaker's gavel hand shook. This is an outrage. An entrapment scheme. You people can't—" "We can," Langston snapped, his tone a sledgehammer now. "And we have. Your courtroom's been under surveillance for 6 months. Every word, every prejudiced ruling, every backroom deal with local prosecutors, all recorded, all documented. And you just walked yourself into a confession." The walls of the room, once allies to Judge Whitaker's tyranny, now closed in around him. The faces in the gallery had shifted, no longer bored or indifferent, but sharpened into something new. Hope, hunger for change. A voice from the back spoke, low and hoarse. "About time." Elijah stepped forward, his chains clinking softly with each stride. "I request, pursuant to federal authority, that Judge Alton Whitaker be immediately relieved of his duties pending investigation." "You don't have that kind of authority here," Whitaker snarled. "You'll find," Elijah replied smoothly, "that I have exactly that authority, and in the interest of transparency." He bent, unfastened the ankle chain, and stepped out of it like a man shaking off old shackles. From his jacket pocket he withdrew a slim identification card. He held it up for the judge, the court reporter, the cameras in the ceiling, and the world beyond. Elijah Carter, Escorner, Special Counsel, U.S. Justice Department. The courtroom erupted. Shocked gasps, a few shouts of disbelief. One woman weeping softly, the sound raw and cathartic. And Ezra Langston. His smile turned almost paternal. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a game. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Judge Whitaker clutched the edges of his bench like a man trying to keep from drowning in rising water. The color had all but drained from his face, leaving his skin pale and mottled, a sharp contrast to the crimson flush creeping up his neck. The smug confidence he'd wielded like a weapon for years was gone, replaced by something raw, something unfamiliar, fear. But even in the face of unraveling control, arrogance dies hard. I don't care what badge you flash, what title you claim, or what charade you staged in my courtroom, Whitaker spat, leaning forward as though proximity alone could diminish the power now standing against him. You think you're clever, boy, dressing like some street rat to embarrass me? You don't belong in my court. Harvard degree or not, you'll never... The words barely cleared his lips before Elijah raised a hand, silencing the room with nothing more than a gesture. It wasn't anger that radiated from him. It wasn't outrage. It was something colder. Precision. Your Honor, Elijah said, voice steady as a blade's edge, I suggest you weigh your next words carefully. Because what you say now won't just stain your career. It'll be read in every newspaper in the country by morning, broadcast across every news network, and filed in the permanent records of the federal judiciary for generations to come. So, choose wisely. Whitaker flinched like he'd been struck, his mouth opening and closing without sound. For the first time in his long, unchecked career, he had no clever retort, no scornful dismissal, no safety net. Elijah stepped closer, resting his palms on the bench's edge so that they stood almost eye to eye. But while Whitaker's gaze darted like a trapped animal's, Elijah's remained cool, unwavering. You mock kids like me because you think we're easy marks, Elijah continued softly. You see brown skin, a hoodie, a public defender, and you assume it's open season. You make jokes, throw out sentencing enhancements like party favors, and sleep like a baby at night because no one ever holds you accountable. Not anymore. The words hung in the air like storm clouds heavy with rain. The gallery, once a silent audience to Whitaker's casual cruelty, now leaned forward. The guards at the back of the room stiffened. The stenographer's fingers hovered, reluctant to miss a single word. Ezra Langston cleared his throat, stepping into the moment like an old general entering a decisive battle. Your Honor, as of 37 minutes ago, an emergency motion for judicial review was filed against your bench by the U.S. Attorney's Office, accompanied by a federal injunction barring you from presiding over any further cases pending the outcome of an ethics and corruption investigation. Your own staff has been subpoenaed, your private correspondence secured. And those cameras in this courtroom, he pointed to the ceiling, they've been recording every closed-door conversation you've had for the last 6 months. Whitaker swayed, his gavel clattering from his hand. This is entrapment. No, Elijah corrected, his voice almost pitying now. This is justice, the kind you never gave to the people who stood in front of you. The courtroom door creaked open once more. Deputy U.S. Marshal Simone Vega stepped inside, her badge gleaming against her dark blue blazer. Judge Alton Whitaker, she announced, voice clear and resolute. You are hereby relieved of your judicial duties pending investigation. I'll ask you to vacate the bench immediately. Gasps rippled again, this time from the court staff themselves, some of whom had begun to sense where the winds were shifting. Whitaker's eyes darted wildly, looking for an ally. He found none. No one here to save you, Langston murmured. Funny how that works. Whitaker stood trembling as Vega approached with 2 uniformed deputies. He tried one last feeble protest. I built this courtroom. This city respects me. No, Elijah said, stepping back, giving him space for his final dissent. You built nothing but walls, and today, those come down. The judge was led away, his robes trailing behind him like a defeated banner. A hush settled over the room, one thick with disbelief and a peculiar, aching kind of hope. When the doors closed behind Whitaker, Ezra Langston turned to the gallery. This courtroom, he said quietly, belongs to the people again. And for the first time in years, a room built on fear erupted into applause. As the applause rippled through courtroom 4B, Elijah Carter stepped back from the bench, his face unreadable, his heart steady. Not one bead of sweat betrayed him, though his veins hummed with the fierce, measured satisfaction of a man who had waited years for this exact moment. He turned, making his way toward the defendant's table, though he wasn't the defendant anymore. The title had never fit. It had been a mask, a tool. Now it was time to cast it aside. Elijah reached into the inside pocket of his worn hoodie and withdrew a slim leather case. He opened it slowly, deliberately, and inside gleamed a crisp, unblemished Georgia State Bar identification card bearing his full name, photograph, and title. Elijah Nathaniel Carter, Esquire Special Counsel, U.S. Department of Justice. He held it high for the room to see, for every skeptic and bystander, for every court clerk who'd smirked at him, every bailiff who'd yanked him by the arm a little too hard, every prosecutor who'd rolled their eyes. A wave of silence swept over the room again, different from before. This one thick with recognition, disbelief, and for some, quiet shame. "I've heard," Elijah began, voice carrying without effort, "that sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to walk its floors, wear its chains, speak its language, and suffer its humiliations until you understand its sickness from the inside." He glanced toward the gallery, toward Ezra Langston, who nodded solemnly, toward the two U.S. attorneys standing by the defense table, toward the black mother in the third row clutching a trembling hand over her heart, tears in her eyes. "That's why I was here." He reached up and removed the ball cap, then the hoodie, revealing a tailored shirt beneath it. Not flashy, but clean, sharp, pressed. His posture shifted too, from the easy sway of a teenager to the erect, assured bearing of a man who knew precisely where he stood. "I didn't come to this courtroom today by accident. This was a strategic operation, authorized by the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, aimed at uncovering long-standing patterns of judicial misconduct, racial discrimination in sentencing, and systemic corruption. Judge Whitaker," he gestured toward the empty bench, "was not the first, but he won't be the last." A few murmurs rose, some startled, others hopeful. Ezra stepped forward, his deep baritone filling the room like a church organ. "And for those who wonder how a man so young pulled this off, let me tell you about Attorney Carter. At 21, he graduated top of his class from Harvard Law, youngest to do so in nearly 50 years. At 22, he won his first Supreme Court case on voting rights violations in Alabama. At 24, he joined our department with a mission to dismantle judicial bias case by case, courthouse by courthouse. Elijah didn't bask in it. He kept his eyes on the people, on the weary faces of those long denied justice. This courtroom," he continued softly, "processed hundreds of young black men and women every year. Harsher sentences, steeper fines, repeat offenses manufactured by a system designed to keep them in chains. I was one of those faces. I made myself one. To prove a point, to force this institution to confront itself in the mirror." The judge's chair sat vacant now, an empty throne. Elijah's gaze settled there for a long, loaded second. "And what we uncovered," he said, his voice hardening, "was a network of case-fixing, falsified reports, prosecutorial coercion, and discriminatory sentencing guidelines endorsed from the highest levels of this jurisdiction. Every ruling, every decision made under Whitaker's gavel for the last 15 years is now under federal review." A ripple moved through the room like a shiver. Elijah took a breath. "To those who've sat in these benches with no one to speak for them, we see you. This isn't theater, it's a reckoning." A woman clapped once, then another, and soon the entire gallery was on its feet, an ovation born not of spectacle, but of long-denied recognition. Ezra reached Elijah's side, clasping his shoulder with a look of quiet pride. "History remembers men who burn down walls," Ezra murmured, "but it builds monuments to the ones who open doors." Elijah nodded, his jaw set, his purpose clear. "I'm not here to burn it down," he said. "I'm here to rebuild it, properly this time." And somewhere outside the old courthouse, beneath a cloudless Atlanta sky, a new chapter in justice quietly began. The storm Elijah Carter had unleashed inside courtroom 4B wasn't confined to its worn wood walls. It spread like an electric pulse through the entire courthouse, spilling into hallways, rippling through the offices of startled clerks, and leaking into nearby chambers where other judges quietly passed word. By the time word reached the district attorney's office, a somber kind of dread had settled into the bones of the institution. Inside 4B, the gallery was still standing, applause tapering into reverent murmurs. People exchanged glances like soldiers realizing the war they'd resigned themselves to losing might finally shift. Elijah, no longer the shackled defendant, stood firm at the front. The two assistant U.S. attorneys, Martinez and Fields, began unpacking folders, placing them in organized stacks atop the defense table. Ezra Langston's phone buzzed. He checked the message, his face tightening with grim satisfaction. "They're already pulling the files," Ezra announced. "Every case Whitaker touched in the last 15 years is being flagged. The DOJ wants preliminary findings within 72 hours, and the chief judge has signed an immediate stay of enforcement on all pending sentences issued by him." A cheer went up from a cluster of young public defenders seated in the back. Some of them had quietly fought Whitaker's biases for years, watched clients withering under his calculated cruelty. A few openly wept. This was more than a courtroom drama. It was the collapse of a monument to quiet violence. But the storm wasn't over. A sharp knock sounded at the courtroom doors. Deputy Marshal Simone Vega re-entered, trailed by two uniformed federal agents carrying sealed evidence boxes. Behind them, the court administrator, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair, looked like he'd aged a decade in the last hour. "Elijah," Vega called, her tone clipped but urgent. "We've got a problem." Elijah's brow furrowed as he stepped forward. "Go ahead." While Judge Whitaker was focused on protecting himself, she said, lowering her voice though every ear strained to hear, he passed multiple sensitive case files through a chain of complicit clerks. Surveillance shows documents being removed from the record room 20 minutes before this hearing started. Trying to cover his tracks, Ezra muttered, his face darkening. "That's not the worst of it," Vega added grimly. She held up a phone. A live feed appeared on the screen. Shaky footage from an exterior security camera. Two men in plain clothes hustling down a loading dock, one of them carrying a box marked Evidence Storage, Restricted. Elijah's jaw clenched. "Who are they?" "One's Marcus Dawes, bailiff, the other's Robert Whitaker." A hush fell. Robert Whitaker, the judge's nephew, a mid-level district attorney notorious for burying cases inconvenient to the city's power brokers. "They're trying to move the evidence out of county jurisdiction," Vega said. "We've got agents tailing them now, but we need an official warrant to seize that box before it crosses the county line." Elijah's mind raced. "Then we don't wait." He strode to the center of the courtroom again, the weight of every eye upon him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice sharp as a thunderclap, "this proceeding isn't over. It never was about one man. Judge Whitaker's corruption is part of a network, one that extends beyond this bench, beyond this courthouse, into prosecutorial offices, law enforcement agencies, and city politics. And now, as we speak, key evidence is being smuggled out to protect them." The room seethed, people shifting in their seats. "I'm authorizing an emergency motion to detain Marcus Dawes and Robert Whitaker," Elijah declared. Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez, file the paperwork. "Vega, alert Federal Highway Patrol. Nobody leaves this jurisdiction with those records." "Yes, sir," Martinez snapped, already reaching for his tablet. Ezra gave a grim nod. "We'll cut them off." It wasn't just a courtroom victory now. It was a hunt. The gallery murmured, the energy rising like a fever pitch, voices carrying the news to those beyond the walls. And somewhere far off, in a quiet office filled with leather chairs and cigar smoke, other men would soon feel the ground tremble beneath them. Justice wasn't coming quietly. It was coming armed, relentless, and led by the very faces they'd tried for decades to dismiss. Outside courtroom 4B, a storm of federal agents and courthouse security fanned across the building like a human net. Radios crackled. Orders were barked. The grim-faced team Vega led moved with a precision that spoke of hard, practiced experience. The news had spread to the highest reaches of the federal building nearby, and now agents from the Civil Rights Division, Internal Affairs, and the FBI were converging on a courthouse that had been untouchable for decades. Inside the courtroom, Elijah Carter hadn't so much as loosened his tie. He stood at the defense table, a stack of evidence folders at his elbow, and a quiet intensity in his gaze. His hand rested on the table as if steadying it, or steadying the room itself. Vega returned moments later, breath sharp, a sheen of sweat on her brow. "They tried to make a break for the Beltway," she reported, the corner of her mouth twisting into something close to a smirk. "Didn't make it." Ezra Langston exhaled a slow, satisfied breath, like a weight lifting off his chest. "And the box?" "Recovered," she confirmed, handing over a flash drive. "And you're going to want to see what's on this." The courtroom fell silent again as the flash drive was connected to the old courtroom's creaking audio-visual system. Elijah moved toward the monitor, remote in hand, the image flickering to life. It wasn't a single file. It was a ledger. Digital scans of handwritten notes, a logbook documenting backroom deals, bribes, altered case outcomes, and worse, a deliberate system designed to exploit young black defendants. Names, dates, charges, notes in the margins like, "Boost to 90 days, teach him a lesson," or "Make sure public defenders unavailable, sentence without counsel." There were signatures too, not just Judge Whitaker's curling script, but the names of prosecutors, clerks, even officers on the street. And not in ones and twos, hundreds. A collective, sickening gasp rippled through the room. One woman in the gallery whispered, "Oh my God," while a young man, someone Elijah recognized from the list of former defendants, put his face in his hands and wept. Elijah let the images scroll, his own expression impassive, letting the evidence speak in the judge's absence. "This," he said quietly, "isn't a courtroom. It was a machine. Designed to grind people down, fill quotas, protect careers, and line pockets. And it's been operating for decades." The words hung in the air like smoke. Every wrongful conviction, every inflated sentence, every destroyed life that passed through these walls. Documented, calculated, authorized. Ezra stepped forward, face grave. "This evidence," he addressed the room, "will form the foundation of a federal indictment. Not just against Judge Whitaker, but against every single official who signed their name in this ledger." Martinez, eyes sharp behind his glasses, added, "This is systematic oppression made policy, and it ends today." Elijah turned toward the people seated in the gallery, his voice dropping low and steady. "For every young man sent to prison over a jaywalking charge, for every woman harassed in these hallways, for every mother who scraped together bail money only to see her son railroaded anyway, this is your vindication." The gallery was no longer silent. People were standing now, heads held higher, some clapping, others crying. Then from the far corner of the room, an older black man rose to his feet. His voice was low, rough from years of swallowed grief. "About time somebody saw us." And the room erupted, not in riotous cheers, but in something deeper, older. Applause laced with pain and pride, grief and gratitude, reverberating off the courtroom walls. Ezra met Elijah's gaze. "You understand," he murmured. "This is just the first wall down." Elijah gave a small, grim smile. "I didn't come to pull one stone. I came to collapse the whole damn house." The sun had begun to set by the time the courtroom doors opened again. spilling soft orange light into the room thick with the scent of old wood and new resolve. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, reporters circling like sharks around anyone willing to speak, while local activists huddled together in cautious celebration. For the first time in decades, Courthouse 4B wasn't a place people left in silence. They left with their heads high. Inside, however, the reckoning was far from finished. Elijah Carter stood with Ezra Langston at the defense table, the sealed evidence boxes now stacked in orderly rows. Assistant U.S. Attorneys Martinez and Fields were still processing paperwork, phones pressed to their ears, while Vega coordinated the removal of complicit staff from the building. But what the room didn't yet know was that Whitaker's corruption wasn't just local. It was part of a broader, darker web, and its threads were already unraveling. Ezra pulled a worn leather folder from his bag, laying it open across the table. Inside were photographs, old case files, financial records, names scrawled in neat cursive. "You'll want to see this," Ezra murmured, his voice low and grave. "These aren't just small-town players, Elijah. This network stretches into the state capitol. Some of those prosecutors on that ledger, connected to higher-ups, campaign donors, district appointments, and more than a few federal cases that never should have disappeared." Elijah's jaw tensed. He sifted through the documents, photographs of closed-door meetings, falsified affidavits, and wire transfers laundered through shell nonprofits meant to fund re-election campaigns and personal real estate ventures. "Every one of these names," Ezra said, tapping a finger on a list of surnames scrawled in neat ink, "had a hand in turning this courthouse into a private factory for convictions. Minorities, the poor, immigrants, they didn't care. It was about numbers, revenue, political capital. And we just ripped the veil off it," Elijah said, his voice steely. Ezra nodded. "But it's bigger than even this city. We traced some of the sentencing patterns to 3 other counties. Same inflated charges, same pattern of unrepresented defendants, same complicit judges. This wasn't just one old racist judge on a power trip. This was a system, and it's nationwide." Elijah stared at the documents, the weight of it pressing down, but he didn't flinch. His entire life had been the product of this machine. He was born into its shadow. He knew its language, its hunger, and now he understood its reach. "Then we don't stop here," he said. Langston's mouth curved into a tired but satisfied smile. "I didn't think you would." At that moment, the courtroom door swung open one last time. A woman in a tailored gray suit stepped through, tall, black, with hair pulled into a precise bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Assistant Director Naomi Grant, U.S. Justice Department," she announced, flashing her credentials. "I've been authorized to inform this court that, as of 6:45 p.m., a federal oversight task force has been activated. Every case presided over by Judge Whitaker is officially under federal review, effective immediately." A ripple moved through the room. "Not shock this time, but relief," Grant continued. "In addition, evidence collected in this investigation has linked multiple sitting judges and district attorneys across the state to similar misconduct. Arrest warrants are being prepared. Media embargo lifts at midnight." "Midnight?" Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Gives us time to arrest them before they can run," Grant replied with a grim smile. Elijah stepped forward. "And the victims?" Grant's expression softened. "Every affected individual will have their case reviewed, sentences vacated where appropriate, and compensation hearings scheduled. Civil suits will follow. We've allocated emergency legal resources." "No one falls through the cracks." Elijah nodded, his voice steady. "Then we begin tonight." Ezra clapped a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You started something no one else could have, kid." "I didn't start it," Elijah murmured. "I just refused to look away." And in that moment, amid the dust, the broken chains, and the shifting light of a setting sun, the courtroom was no longer a place of quiet cruelty. It was a war room, the first stronghold in a battle that had been waiting too long. And the people, for once, were ready. Night had draped itself over the city by the time the official seals were pressed onto the doors of courtroom 4B. Federal marshals cordoned off the building. Journalists clamored behind barricades, and on the courthouse steps, a growing crowd of onlookers waited with a hunger that tasted like hope. There hadn't been a night like this in Atlanta in years. Inside, however, the real work had only begun. Elijah Carter stood at the now abandoned judge's bench, flipping through a case file that might have, on any other day, sentenced another young life to the same pipeline he'd narrowly escaped. The pages were filled with the careless notations of injustice, a scribbled "max it out," a lazy stamp denying bail, a prosecutor's note urging "make it stick." It felt less like a legal document and more like a death warrant masquerading as procedure. Ezra Langston approached, his phone pressed to his ear, nodding as he took rapid notes in a small leather-bound journal. "They've got Whitaker in holding," Ezra reported, his tone sharp. "Refusing to talk so far. Claims he's being framed. His nephew folded inside 20 minutes, though. Gave up names, dates, everything we needed." Elijah didn't smile. There was no satisfaction left in watching corrupt men flail. Only purpose. "And the others?" Elijah asked. 15 more arrested since sunset," Ezra confirmed. 7 judges, 5 prosecutors, 3 officers. 2 tried to skip town, didn't get far. Naomi Grant's team is securing safe houses for key witnesses tonight. Elijah nodded. He felt the movement of it more than he registered it. His mind was already scanning the next 20 steps. A loud rap sounded against the double doors. Vega appeared with 2 younger marshals, leading a man Elijah instantly recognized. Worn suit, gray hair thinning, eyes darting nervously. "Assistant District Attorney Norris," Vega announced. "Brought himself in. Says he wants to cooperate." Ezra chuckled without humor. Funny how bold men become cowards when the lights get too bright. Norris's voice shook. I have names. Records. I didn't know how deep it went." "I swear, I didn't know they were—" "Save it," Elijah cut him off, his voice sharp but even. "You had choices. You made them. Now you'll deal with what's left." He gestured for Martinez to take the statement. The wheels of justice were already turning, and Elijah wouldn't waste one more second on men who'd spent decades stealing futures. But it wasn't the confessions that mattered now. It was the rebuilding. Elijah turned to the gallery, where word had spread that verdicts were being overturned and sentences vacated. Families had gathered, mothers who hadn't seen sons free in years, a father who hadn't heard from his daughter since a wrongful conviction over a stolen phone she never touched. And then Elijah spoke, not from behind the bench or at a podium, but from the heart of the room where the accused had once stood. "To every family who lost time, every young man and woman whose names were buried under false charges, to every person told you didn't matter, that your life was expendable for a quota, listen carefully," he began, voice carrying to the farthest corner. "You were never invisible. You were never worthless. The system told you that lie because it feared what you might become if you realized your worth." Heads lifted, eyes met his. And now that lie is done. Applause rose, not like a polite courtroom courtesy, but a rumble of raw, aching release. Ezra stepped beside him, voice steady. "Starting tomorrow, a legal aid initiative will be set up at this courthouse. Every overturned case gets an advocate, a job placement partner, a mental health liaison. We rebuild better than what they tore down." Vega grinned, the weight of the night softening her stern expression. "And a task force already approved by DC will expand this investigation state by state, county by county, every court, every badge, every desk. No one's untouchable anymore." The room roared, but it was the last act that changed everything. Elijah reached into his pocket, pulling free a worn business card. He held it up. "For every kid in this city," he said, voice cracking just enough to remind them he wasn't a statue. "There'll be scholarships, legal apprenticeships, a courtroom literacy program in every public school. This place will not be remembered for how many it caged, but for how many it saved after." The cheers came then, loud, messy, defiant. and the weight of generations felt just a little lighter. Ezra clapped a hand on his shoulder again. "You ready for tomorrow?" Elijah's jaw tightened, but his eyes glinted. "Tomorrow's what I came for." And somewhere far away, another old, indifferent system felt its walls tremble. By dawn, the city was different. Atlanta's skyline shimmered against a pale orange sky, streets damp from a light overnight rain that hadn't quite washed away the echoes of the night before. But something else lingered in the air, the taste of a new beginning. And in neighborhoods where folks had long learned not to hope too high, people woke to news broadcasts naming names they never thought would fall. At Elijah Carter's insistence, the federal press conference wasn't held at a government building or polished downtown office. It took place on the courthouse steps of 4B, the very same place where so many lives had quietly been erased. The podium was simple, the flag stiff in a faint morning breeze, and the crowd spilled into the streets. Elijah stood beside Ezra Langston, Naomi Grant, and Simone Vega. Faces he trusted now, soldiers in a war older than any of them. He didn't wear a suit this time, no tie, no badge on his hip, just a crisp, open-collared shirt and the scars of a long night's work. Cameras flashed, reporters jostled, microphones clustered like hungry insects. But Elijah didn't speak for them. Not really. He spoke for the man who wept in the back row last night, for the woman who clutched her son's expungement order like a holy relic, for the clerk too afraid to testify who'd slipped him evidence in secret, and for his younger self, the boy who'd sat in a cold holding cell wondering if anyone would ever come for him. "This city," Elijah began, steady, measured, "belongs to its people, not to the powerful few who believe their titles shield them from consequence. Not to the men who mistake control for justice, or to the ones who traded young lives for political favors." The crowd hushed. For too long, Black and brown children in this city have walked into courthouses that saw them not as citizens, but as statistics, not as children, but as threats. And every system that allows that to happen, every official who profits from it, should know their time is up. His voice never wavered. Judge Whitaker's arrest is not the end. It's the opening act. There are others. You know their names. Some of you voted for them. Some of you feared them. But now you'll see them held accountable. A cheer rose, sharp and sudden. Elijah let it settle before continuing. And to the young people listening, sitting in classrooms where no one bothers to ask your name, walking streets where you're followed in every store, hear me. You are not expendable. You are not disposable. And no system built against you will stand forever. Ezra clapped his hand on Elijah's back, pride evident in the way his eyes shone against the morning sun. Naomi Grant stepped up next, her voice clear as glass. "As of this morning, 24 officials are in federal custody, another 50 under investigation. Civil rights task forces are being dispatched to neighboring counties. Emergency legal services are being established for families affected. And every remaining case connected to Judge Whitaker is suspended pending federal review." Another wave of applause. But it wasn't just the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. Across the city, in church basements, coffee shops, hospital waiting rooms, and crowded apartments, people watched. And something shifted. A fracture in the unspoken agreement that injustice was inevitable. A small, unyielding hope. Elijah turned to Vega and Martinez as the press surged forward. "We ready?" he asked. "As ready as we'll ever be," Vega grinned. "Always ready," Martinez replied. Elijah nodded, and as the flashbulbs burst and the chants began, he whispered to himself, a promise, a prayer, a vow he knew wouldn't end with this city. We're not done yet. And somewhere far from that courthouse in a dozen other cities where other walls waited to fall, the world felt it. A reckoning born of one man's refusal to stay in his place. A boy in a hoodie. A genius in disguise, and the beginning of a new kind of justice. The storm didn't end that day, but the winds had changed. and for once the people knew which way they blew. The sun was high by the time the last of the federal vans pulled away from the courthouse. The barricades came down, and the old building stood exposed under the harsh clarity of daylight, its cracked walls, its tired windows, its long history of silent suffering no longer hidden behind ritual and routine. The paint peeled, the stonework sagged, but something about it felt lighter. Elijah Carter lingered on the courthouse steps, watching the city move around him. A woman passed by holding a toddler in one arm and a yellow envelope in the other, the kind of envelope used to deliver case dismissals. A young man leaned against a lamppost reading a legal aid flyer. And across the street, a barber hung a sign in his window that read, "Justice is good business." Ezra Langston approached quietly, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one without a word, and Elijah took it, grateful for the warmth, the weight of it in his palm. "You did it," Ezra said, his voice low, touched with something like reverence. "What most of us only dreamed about." Elijah took a slow sip. The bitterness was grounding. "No," he said softly. "We did one chapter. There's a library left." The older man chuckled, nodding. "You're right, but you cracked the spine, son, and that matters." They stood in silence for a while, watching the slow pulse of the city as it tried to recalibrate around its own history. There was something holy in the ordinary today. A mother walking her kids to school without fear. A parole officer sitting on a stoop, laughing with a man he used to supervise. The small, rebellious act of existing freely. Elijah thought about his mother then, about how she'd warned him that some systems were built so solidly against people like them. No amount of good grades or clean records could protect you. "Some places, baby," she'd whispered. "They got their mind made up about you before you even say your name." And for years he believed it, until he didn't. Until he realized the trick wasn't in playing their game, but in making them answer for it. He looked at Ezra. "You staying in the city?" "For now," the older man said. "Long enough to see you get that legal aid center up. Long enough to see you scare the hell out of a few more judges." A grin tugged at Elijah's mouth. "Good, I'll need you." "I ain't going nowhere, son." Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed. Elijah watched a line of teenagers pass by in fresh sneakers and old hoodies, laughing at something none of the adults would ever fully understand. The city was already theirs. It had just taken this long to remind the world of it. Elijah turned toward the old courthouse one last time. The building would stand for a while longer, but its power had been stripped away, its ghosts laid bare, and its walls would never again be trusted to hide injustice in plain sight. He drew a breath deep into his chest, the air cool, clean, a promise rising in his blood. We're not done yet. And as the city moved around him, Elijah Carter stepped off the steps of courtroom 4B, not as a defendant, not as a prodigy, not even as a government agent, but as a man who'd kept his promise and was ready for the next fight,